3 months. That's how long Daniel had been living in that tiny apartment above the old bookstore. 3 months of quiet evenings, simple dinners, and zero drama. After everything that happened in the city, after the divorce and the job he walked away from, this was exactly what he needed. Peace, silence, a chance to figure out who he was without all the noise. The apartment wasn't much to look at. The floors creaked when you walked. The radiator made weird clanking sounds at night, and sometimes the whole place smelled like old paper from the bookstore below. But it was his. No one to answer to. No one asking where he'd been or why he looked so tired. Just him and his thoughts and whatever frozen dinner he decided to heat up that night. That Tuesday started like any other. He'd spent the day organizing his bookshelf for the 3rd time that week, pretending it was productive. Around 6 in the evening, he was standing in his tiny kitchen, watching pasta spin around in the microwave when he heard it. A knock, soft, almost apologetic, the kind of knock that makes you wonder if you actually heard anything at all. He wasn't expecting anyone. The landlord had his number. The few friends he still talked to knew better than to show up unannounced. For a second he considered ignoring it, but the knock came again, a little more insistent this time. When Daniel opened the door, he forgot how to breathe for just a moment. Not because she was stunningly beautiful or anything like that. It was something else. Something in the way she stood there in the dim hallway light, like she wasn't quite sure if she should be there at all. She had dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, a few strands falling around her face. Her jacket was too big for her, faded denim that looked like it had seen better days. But what really got him were her eyes. They had this look, like she was searching for something but trying not to seem too desperate about it. And that smile. God, that smile. It was barely there, hovering on her lips like it might disappear any second. "I'm really sorry to bother you," she said, and her voice was quieter than he expected. Gentle, careful. "I'm Elena. I just moved into apartment 2B downstairs. The landlord mentioned you might have a spare key to the utility closet. My electricity keeps going out, and I think it's the breaker." Daniel just stood there for a second, processing. A neighbor. A new neighbor. Someone living right below him, and he hadn't even noticed anyone moving in. "Oh yeah," he finally managed. "The breaker. That thing's ancient. Give me a second." He walked to his kitchen, leaving the door open, suddenly very aware of how messy his apartment was. Dishes in the sink. Books scattered everywhere. His laptop still open on the couch with the same blank document he'd been staring at for weeks. He rummaged through the drawer where he kept random stuff until he found the old brass key. When he came back to the door, she was still standing in the exact same spot, hands tucked into her jacket pockets. She hadn't tried to peek inside, hadn't moved an inch. Something about that struck him as odd, but he couldn't quite put his finger on why. "Here you go," he said, holding out the key. Their fingers touched briefly during the exchange, just for a second, but it was enough for him to notice how cold her hands were. And maybe it was his imagination, but they seemed to be shaking just a little. "Thank you so much," she said, and there was that smile again, barely there, like she was rationing them out. "I really appreciate it. I'll bring it back tomorrow." "No rush," Daniel said. "I never use it anyway." She nodded, started to turn away, then paused. "It's nice to meet you, by the way. I'll try not to be a noisy neighbor." "Same here," he said, even though he knew he was probably the quietest person in the building. And then she was gone, disappearing down the stairwell with quick, light steps. Daniel stood in his doorway for way longer than made sense, staring at the empty hallway. There was this scent lingering in the air, something flowery. Jasmine, maybe? He wasn't good with flowers. He closed the door slowly and walked back to his kitchen. The microwave was beeping. His pasta had been done for a while now, probably overheated and rubbery. But he didn't really care about that anymore. His mind was somewhere else entirely. There was something about her. Something he couldn't quite name. The way she held herself, like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. The way that smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The cold hands. The too big jacket on a warm September evening. Daniel ate his dinner on autopilot, barely tasting it. He kept thinking about that brief encounter. How long had he been living here without talking to anyone? How long had it been since he'd actually looked at another person, really looked at them and felt curious about their story? He'd spent 3 months trying to become invisible, hiding from his old life, from the mess he'd left behind, from the person he used to be. He'd gotten pretty good at it too. Wake up, Go through the motions, go to bed, repeat. No connections. No complications. No chance of getting hurt again. But something about those few minutes in his doorway had cracked something open inside him. Something he'd been keeping carefully sealed. Later that night, as he tried to focus on the book he was reading, he found himself listening. Really listening. To the sounds of the building, the old pipes, the distant traffic, and somewhere below him, the faint sounds of someone moving around in apartment 2B. Footsteps, a door closing, the muffled sound of music playing, so quiet he almost couldn't hear it. She was right there, right below him, probably dealing with that temperamental breaker, probably unpacking boxes in an empty apartment, starting over in a new place, just like he had 3 months ago. Daniel closed his book and stared at the ceiling. He wondered what her story was. What had brought her here, to this old building with its creaky floors and unreliable electricity? Why she'd knocked on his door with that apologetic softness, like she was afraid of taking up even a moment of his time. Why her hands had been so cold and why that smile seemed like something she had to work at. He told himself to stop. It was none of his business. She was just a neighbor who needed a key. That was it. Nothing more. He'd give her space, she'd give him space, and they'd coexist in this building like all the other tenants. Polite nods in the hallway. Maybe a wave if they crossed paths at the mailboxes. That's how these things worked. But as he lay in bed that night staring at the shadows on his ceiling, Daniel couldn't shake the image of her standing in his doorway. That barely there smile, those searching eyes, the way she'd held herself like she was ready to disappear at any moment. He didn't know it then, but that simple knock on his door, that brief exchange of a key and a few words, had started something. Something that would change both of their lives in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Sometimes the most important moments look like nothing at all. Just a neighbor asking for help. Just a Tuesday evening. Just a barely there smile in a dimly lit hallway. But Daniel couldn't look away. And somewhere deep down in a place he wasn't ready to admit existed, he didn't want to. The thing about living in a small building is that you start to notice patterns. Daniel hadn't planned on paying attention. He'd spent 3 months perfecting the art of not noticing anything. But after that Tuesday evening, after Elena knocked on his door with that key request, something shifted. Suddenly he was aware of everything. He'd see her in the morning sometimes, leaving for work around 7:30, always in simple clothes, nothing flashy, jeans and a sweater. That same oversized denim jacket even though September was warming up. She carried this worn leather messenger bag that looked like it had traveled the world. Never a purse. Never anything cute or decorative. Just that bag, slung across her shoulder like it contained everything important in her life. They'd cross paths in the narrow stairwell and she'd give him that small smile. The barely there one. A quiet good morning in that gentle voice. He'd nod back, say something about the weather, and they'd go their separate ways. Nothing deep. Nothing personal. Just neighbor stuff, but Daniel noticed things. Maybe more than he should have. Like how she always took the stairs slowly, one hand on the railing like she was ready to turn around and run at any moment. How she checked over her shoulder before putting her key in the lock. How she never left her apartment door open, not even for a second while grabbing her mail. One morning he was leaving for his walk to the coffee shop when he heard music coming from her apartment. Not loud but clear enough through the thin walls. Something classical piano music. It was beautiful and sad at the same time. The kind of music that makes you feel things you weren't planning to feel at 7 in the morning. The shared laundry room was in the basement, a cramped space with 2 washers and 2 dryers that barely worked. Daniel usually did his laundry on Sunday mornings when the building was quiet. But one Wednesday afternoon he'd run out of clean clothes and had no choice but to venture down there. Elena was already there, standing in front of one of the dryers, folding clothes with this mechanical precision. Every shirt folded exactly the same way. Every pair of jeans creased in the same spots. It was almost hypnotic to watch. "Hey," he said, not wanting to startle her. She turned, and for just a flash he saw something in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or surprise. But then it was gone, replaced by that careful smile. "Hi," she said. "Sorry, I'm hogging the good dryer. The other one doesn't really dry anything." "No worries," Daniel said, loading his clothes into the washer. "I've got time." They worked in silence for a while. Not awkward silence. Just the quiet hum of machines and the distant sound of traffic from the street above. Daniel noticed that Elena's hands were shaking slightly as she folded. Just a small tremor, but it was there. Then the thunder started. Not close, just distant rumbling. A storm moving in from somewhere out west. The kind of thunder you barely notice, except Elena noticed. She flinched so hard she dropped the shirt she was holding. Her whole body went rigid and her breathing got quick and shallow. She grabbed the edge of the folding table to steady herself. "Sorry," she said immediately, bending to pick up the shirt. "I'm just storms. They make me jumpy." Daniel wanted to ask why. Wanted to understand what could make someone react like that to a little thunder. But something in her posture stopped him. The way she'd curled in on herself like she was trying to become smaller. The way her knuckles were white from gripping that table. "Me too," he lied. "Hate storms, it wasn't true." He actually liked storms. The drama of them. The way they cleared the air. But in that moment, it felt like the right thing to say. Like maybe if she knew she wasn't alone in this random fear, it would be easier. Elena looked up at him, and something in her expression softened. Just a little. Like he'd said exactly what she needed to hear. They finished their laundry together as the storm rolled in outside. The rain started hitting the small basement windows, creating this rhythmic sound that filled the room. Elena still jumped at each crack of thunder, but less violently now. Daniel pretended not to notice, just kept folding his clothes and making small talk about nothing important. When they were done, they walked upstairs together. The building's ancient elevator was broken again, so it was 2 flights of stairs with baskets of clean laundry. Elena went first, still checking over her shoulder every few steps. At her floor, she paused before heading to her apartment. "Thanks," she said quietly, "for before." "In the laundry room, for what?" Daniel asked, genuinely confused. "For not asking questions," she said. "And for the storm thing. Even if you were just being nice." She disappeared into her apartment before he could respond, leaving Daniel standing in the hallway feeling like he'd just witnessed something important, but wasn't quite sure what. Over the next couple of weeks, these small moments kept happening. He'd be getting his mail and she'd be there too. They'd end up walking to the corner coffee shop at the same time. She'd be sitting on the building's front steps one evening when he came home from his walk, and they'd talk about the neighborhood, about the bookstore downstairs, about nothing and everything. But there were other things Daniel noticed too. Things that worried him even though he had no right to be worried about a neighbor he barely knew. Like how her lights stayed on until well past midnight most nights. He could see them from his kitchen window, this soft glow from apartment 2B. He wondered what she was doing down there, why she couldn't sleep. One night around 2 a.m, Daniel got up for water and looked out his window. Elena was sitting on the front steps of the building, still in the same clothes she'd worn that day. Her arms were wrapped around herself even though it was warm out. She was just sitting there staring at nothing, completely still. He thought about going down, asking if she was okay. But something stopped him. Maybe the feeling that she'd chosen to be out there, that she needed the space. Or maybe he was just scared. Scared of getting involved, of caring about someone else's problems when he'd worked so hard to avoid having any problems of his own. The next morning, when they passed in the stairwell, Elena looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, that smile taking more effort than usual. "Couldn't sleep?" Daniel asked before he could stop himself. She paused, one hand on the railing. "Not really, you?" "I'm a terrible sleeper," he said, which was true. "Have been for years." "Me too," she said. And for the first time since he'd met her, that smile looked almost real. "Maybe it's the building. Something in the water." They both laughed, and it felt like a door had opened. Just a crack, just enough to let a little light through. Daniel went to the coffee shop that morning thinking about that laugh. About how different Elena's face looked when she wasn't forcing that careful smile. How young she actually was. Probably only late 20s, though she carried herself like someone much older. He wondered what her story was. What had happened to make someone so careful, so watchful, so afraid of thunder and late nights and simply existing in the world? But he knew better than to ask. Some things people tell you when they're ready. Some things stay hidden until trust builds enough to hold the weight of them. What Daniel didn't realize yet was that Elena was wondering about him too. Wondering what had brought him to this building. Why he lived alone. Why he seemed content to just exist without really living. Wondering if maybe, just maybe, they were both running from something, or towards something, or just trying to figure out how to stand still long enough to catch their breath. It happened on a Friday night in October, the kind of night where the city gets quiet after midnight, where the streets empty out and the only sounds are distant sirens and the occasional car passing by. Daniel had been asleep for maybe 2 hours when something woke him. At first, he thought it was a dream. Muffled sounds from somewhere below. Voices, maybe. The sound of furniture scraping across a floor. Then silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, like something's missing that should be there. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to decide if he'd actually heard anything or if his mind was playing tricks. The building made weird noises at night. Old pipes, other tenants coming home late. Nothing to worry about. Then he heard footsteps on the stairs. Fast footsteps, running. The knock on his door was desperate, not like that first time, soft and apologetic. This was urgent, scared. The kind of knock that makes your heart race before you even open the door. Daniel threw off his blankets and rushed to the door, almost tripping over his own feet in the dark. When he yanked it open, Elena was standing there, and everything about her was wrong. Her face was pale, paper white in the dim hallway light. There was a cut above her eyebrow, small but bleeding. Her hair had come loose from its usual ponytail, falling around her face in messy tangles. She wasn't wearing shoes. Just socks, and that thin t-shirt and jeans, no jacket, like she'd run out of her apartment in a hurry. But what really got him were her hands. They were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to keep them still. And her eyes. God, her eyes looked like she'd seen something terrible. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know where else to go." He found me, Daniel didn't think. Didn't ask questions. He just moved aside and pulled her inside, closing the door behind her and locking it. His hands found the deadbolt, the chain lock, everything he never usually bothered with. "Sit down," he said, guiding her to his couch. "Just sit. You're safe here." Elena sat, but she couldn't stay still. Her knee bounced up and down rapidly. Her hands kept moving, clutching at her arms, her hair, the edge of the couch, like she needed to hold on to something physical to prove she was really there. Daniel grabbed his first aid kit from the bathroom, his mind racing. Who found her? What happened? Should he call the police? But he pushed those questions aside and focused on what he could do right now. "Let me look at that cut," he said, sitting beside her carefully, giving her space. "It's not deep, but we should clean it." As he dabbed at the cut with an antiseptic wipe, Elena started talking. The words came out in fragments at first, disjointed and rushed like she couldn't get them out fast enough. "His name is Trevor. We dated for 2 years. I thought we were good. But then things changed. He got possessive, jealous, started showing up at my work, calling me 50 times a day. I tried to break up with him, but he wouldn't accept it." Daniel's hand stilled for a moment, but he forced himself to keep working. "Keep listening. It got worse," Elena continued, her voice flat now, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized. "He'd follow me home, show up outside my apartment at 3 in the morning, send me hundreds of texts. I got a restraining order. I changed my phone number. I moved twice. Nothing worked." She looked up at Daniel then, and the pain in her eyes was so raw it hurt to see. "So I moved here. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not my family, not my friends. I just disappeared. Changed jobs, changed everything. I've been so careful. No social media. No patterns. I take different routes home every day. I thought I was finally safe." "What happened tonight?" Daniel asked gently, finishing with the cut and putting a small bandage over it. "I heard someone at my door," Elena said, wrapping her arms around herself, trying the handle. "I looked through the peephole and it was him, Trevor. I don't know how he found me. I've been so careful." Her voice cracked completely then, and tears started streaming down her face. He was talking through the door, saying he just wanted to talk, that he missed me, that we belonged together, but I could hear it in his voice. That anger. That thing that made me so scared before. So I grabbed my phone and ran. I didn't even think. I just ran. Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. Anger maybe, or fear, or both mixed together into something he didn't quite know how to name. "We need to call the police," he said, pulling out his phone. Elena nodded, still shaking. "The restraining order. I have a copy on my phone. They need to know he violated it." The next hour was a blur. Daniel called 911 while Elena sat on his couch, wrapped in the blanket he'd given her. Two officers showed up within 20 minutes, a man and a woman, both professional and kind. They took Elena's statement, checked her apartment, walked the whole building, but Trevor was gone. Disappeared before the police arrived, like he'd sensed them coming. "We've documented everything," the female officer said, handing Elena a case number. "We'll update the restraining order and increase patrols in this area. Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" Elena started to say something about a hotel, but Daniel interrupted. "She can stay here," he said, on the couch, "if that's okay with her." The officers looked at each other, then at Elena, who nodded gratefully. After they left, Daniel made tea because he didn't know what else to do. His hands shook a little as he poured the hot water. The apartment felt too quiet, too still after all that chaos. "You don't have to let me stay," Elena said from the couch. "I can find somewhere else." "Stop," Daniel said, bringing over 2 mugs. "You're staying." End of discussion. They sat in silence for a while, drinking tea that was too hot and probably too sweet. The city outside was starting to wake up. Early morning light was creeping through the windows, turning everything gray and soft. "I've been running for 8 months," Elena said quietly, moving every few weeks, looking over my shoulder constantly, living like a ghost. "I thought if I could just disappear completely, if I could make myself invisible enough, he'd forget about me. He'd move on." "That's not how people like that work," Daniel said. "It's not your fault he can't let go." "I know," Elena said, but her voice suggested she didn't really believe it. "In my head, I know that. But sometimes I wonder what I did wrong, what I could have done differently." "Nothing," Daniel said firmly. "You did nothing wrong." Elena looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe. Recognition. Two people who knew what it felt like to run from something, to hide from the world, to try to make themselves small enough to disappear. As the sun came up fully, Elena finally stopped shaking. She curled up on the couch, still wrapped in Daniel's blanket, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she was asleep, exhausted by fear and adrenaline and the weight of carrying all this alone for so long. Daniel sat in his armchair across from her, watching the morning light paint patterns on the walls. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every sound in the building made him tense, ready to jump up if she needed him. He thought about the past 3 months, how he'd come here to hide, to escape, to avoid feeling anything too deeply, how carefully he'd constructed this quiet, empty life, and how one knock on his door had changed everything. Elena had trusted him with her worst moment, with her fear and her story and her vulnerability, and somewhere in the past hour, Daniel had made a decision without even realizing it. He wasn't going to let her face this alone. Whatever came next, whatever happened with Trevor or the police or anything else, he'd be there. Not because he had to be. Not because it was the neighborly thing to do. But because for the first time in a very long time, Daniel cared about someone other than himself. And caring, he was beginning to remember, meant showing up, meant standing beside someone even when things got scary. As Elena slept on his couch, her face finally peaceful, Daniel watched over her and understood something important. Sometimes you don't find purpose. Sometimes it finds you, knocking on your door at 3 a.m, bleeding and scared and desperately in need of someone to see them. And sometimes, if you're lucky and brave enough, you open that door. Elena stayed on Daniel's couch for 3 nights. Not because her apartment wasn't safe. The landlord had changed all the locks and added a security chain, but because she couldn't bring herself to sleep alone down there yet. Because every sound made her jump. Because the silence felt too heavy to bear by herself. Daniel didn't mind. Actually, that's not quite true. He did mind, but in a good way. In a way that made him realize how empty his apartment had felt before, how quiet his life had become. Having someone there, even someone dealing with something as serious as Elena was, made the space feel alive again. They developed a routine quickly. Elena would wake up early, always apologetic about taking up his space, and Daniel would tell her to stop apologizing. He'd make coffee, she'd make toast, and they'd sit at his small kitchen table watching the morning light come through the windows. During the day, while Elena was at work, Daniel found himself thinking about her constantly, wondering if she was okay, if Trevor had showed up at her job, if she was eating lunch or just pushing through on adrenaline and fear. He'd check his phone compulsively, making sure she hadn't texted him anything urgent. In the evenings, they'd have dinner together. Sometimes Daniel cooked. Other times they'd order takeout and eat straight from the containers while sitting on the floor, because his couch wasn't really big enough for two people to eat comfortably. And they talked. Really talked. About everything. Elena told him about growing up in Portland, about her mom who taught elementary school and her dad who played guitar in a local band on weekends, about her childhood dog named Biscuit and how she used to build elaborate forts in her backyard, about wanting to be a photographer since she was 12 years old. "I got my first camera from my grandmother," she said one night, picking at her Chinese food, this old film camera that she'd used to document family stuff for years. "She taught me how to see things. Not just look at them, but really see them. The light, the shadows, the story in every moment. Do you still have it?" Daniel asked. "Yeah," Elena said, and for the first time in days she smiled for real. "It's in my apartment. Maybe I'll show you sometime." Daniel shared his story too, about meeting his ex-wife in college, about thinking they'd grow old together, about the slow realization that they wanted different things, had become different people, about the divorce that was amicable on paper but devastating in reality. "I thought I was fine," he told her. "Told everyone I was fine. But then I found myself living in this apartment, avoiding everyone I knew, pretending that being alone was the same as being at peace." "Is it?" Elena asked quietly. "No," Daniel admitted. "It's just different, easier maybe, but not better." On the second night, a thunderstorm rolled through the city around midnight. Daniel was half asleep in his bed when he heard Elena cry out from the living room. He rushed out to find her sitting bolt upright on the couch, hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. He didn't ask permission, just sat beside her and pulled her close, letting her bury her face against his shoulder as the thunder crashed overhead. She was shaking violently, her whole body trembling with each boom. "I know it's stupid," she said between gasps. "I know it can't hurt me. But when I was with Trevor, when things were at their worst, there was this storm. He showed up at my old apartment during this massive thunderstorm, banging on the door, screaming. And now every time I hear thunder, I'm back there. I can't stop my brain from going back there." "It's not stupid," Daniel said firmly. "Trauma does that. It rewires your brain, makes connections where there shouldn't be any." They sat like that until the storm passed, Daniel holding her while she cried, while she shook, while the fear worked its way through her system. When it was finally over, Elena pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I'm a mess," she said, trying to laugh it off. "You're surviving," Daniel corrected. "That's not the same thing as being a mess." On the third day, Elena brought her laptop up to Daniel's apartment. After dinner, she opened it hesitantly, like she wasn't sure if this was a good idea. "Can I show you something?" she asked. "Of course," Daniel said. She turned the screen toward him, and Daniel found himself looking at hundreds of photographs. Elena's photographs. And they were stunning. Not in the obvious picture-perfect way, but in the way that made you stop and really look. There was a photo of a fire escape in the morning light, the metal creating geometric shadows on a brick wall. A picture of cracks in sidewalk concrete, weeds pushing through with determined resilience. An elderly woman feeding pigeons in a park, her face soft with joy. A rusted bike chained to a fence, flowers growing wild around it. "These are incredible," Daniel said, and he meant it. "Elena, these are really, really good." She ducked her head, embarrassed but pleased. "I take pictures of things that stay. Buildings, streets, objects, things that don't leave." Daniel understood what she wasn't saying. In a life where she'd been forced to keep moving, to keep disappearing, she'd found comfort in permanence. In things that would still be there tomorrow. "People leave," Elena said quietly. "But buildings don't, streets don't. That fire escape will be there in 10 years, probably longer. There's something comforting about that." They spent the next hour going through her portfolio, Elena explaining her choices, her techniques, why she'd taken each shot. Daniel watched her face transform as she talked about her work. The fear disappeared. The tension in her shoulders eased. This was Elena without the weight of trauma, Elena just being herself. "Have you ever thought about showing these?" Daniel asked. "Like in a gallery or something?" Elena shrugged. "Trevor used to say they were a waste of time, that I should get a real hobby." "Trevor was an idiot," Daniel said flatly. "These are art, real art. People should see them." Something shifted in Elena's expression then, like she was allowing herself to believe it just a little bit. On the third evening, after the police had called to say they'd arrested Trevor at his own apartment for violating the restraining order, Elena decided it was time to go back to her place, The landlord had installed a better lock. The police had increased patrols. She couldn't hide forever. Before she left, Daniel gave her his phone number written on a piece of paper, even though she already had it in her phone. "Call me anytime," he said. "If you hear something weird. If you can't sleep. If you just want to talk. Literally anytime. I don't care if it's 4 in the morning." Elena took the paper, folded it carefully, and put it in her pocket. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For opening your door. For not asking a million questions. For just being there." "That's what neighbors do," Daniel said. But they both knew it was more than that. Elena hugged him then, quick but tight, and Daniel realized it was the first time she'd initiated physical contact. The first time she'd let her guard down enough to reach out instead of waiting to be reached for. After she left, Daniel's apartment felt too quiet again. But this time it was different. It wasn't the heavy quiet of loneliness. It was the gentle quiet of anticipation, of knowing someone was just downstairs, of being part of someone else's life even in this small way. Over the next few weeks, their friendship settled into something solid and real. They'd have dinner together 3 or 4 times a week, alternating apartments. Elena would cook these elaborate meals, explaining each ingredient like she was teaching him a secret language. Daniel would help her rearrange furniture in her apartment, suggesting ways to make the space feel more like home. Elena taught Daniel about photography composition, about the rule of thirds and negative space and how light could change everything. Daniel shared chapters of the book he'd been trying to write for 5 years, and Elena gave him feedback that was honest but kind. When storms came, Elena would knock on Daniel's door and they'd sit together until the thunder passed. She was getting better. The shaking wasn't as bad. Sometimes she could even laugh about it, making jokes about being afraid of a little weather. Slowly, Daniel watched Elena transform. Her shoulders relaxed. That barely there smile became more frequent, more genuine. She started sleeping with her lights off. She'd walk to the coffee shop without checking over her shoulder every 5 seconds. One evening, she showed up at his door with her old film camera, the one from her grandmother. "Teach me something," Daniel said, holding it carefully. So Elena taught him how to load film, how to adjust the aperture, how to frame a shot. They went up to the roof of the building, a space Daniel didn't even know existed, and took pictures of the city at sunset. "Photography is about capturing a moment," Elena explained, adjusting the focus. "But it's also about deciding what matters. What you include in the frame is just as important as what you leave out." Daniel thought about that later, about what it meant to choose what mattered, about how for 3 months he'd tried to leave everything out, to make his life so small and empty that nothing could hurt him. But Elena had shown him that including things, including people, was what made life worth living, even when it was scary. As they stood on that roof watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Daniel realized something important. He'd opened his door that first night thinking he was just helping a neighbor with a key. He'd opened it again at 3 in the morning thinking he was just offering shelter from danger. But really, every time he'd opened that door,